George Gershwin was born Jacob Gershowitz in Brooklyn in September 1898 as the second child in a Russian Jewish immigrant family. George and his older brother Ira would frequently attend local Yiddish language theater as they grew up. While every one of their 4 children, the younger 2 being Arthur and Francis, had some involvement in music, their parents invested in piano lessons for Ira when he was 12 and George was 10. But George was much more fascinated by the instrument than Ira ever was, and Ira was fine with conceding lessons to his kid brother, who had already learned several songs by playing them at player pianos in friends' apartments. His first serious piano teacher was a fellow named Charles Hambitzer, who took Gershwin through a fairly conventional course of classical study. Gershwin always thought a lot of Hambitzer, whom he credited with much of his playing technique, as well as introducing him to the few classical repertoire pieces he played throughout his life, the Chopin Preludes. Early on, Gershwin was also influenced by what you might call light classical music, pieces which were accessible to amateur audiences and largely anticipated the memorable pentatonic melodies and regular phrase structures of popular music. Chief among these in the zeitgeist was Antonin Dvorak's Humoresque in G-flat major, Opus 101 No. 7, coincidentally composed while he was living in the United States. Dvorak was a big Americanophile. Ameriphile? There's not really a word for that. Point is, he liked American music, and he wanted American composers to pursue using that in their works. It was Dvorak's idea for American composers to be as nationalistic as European composers had been in adopting the music of their homeland in a larger Western tradition. Compared to many, the Gershwins lived a comfortably middle-class to upper-middle-class life, although they lived on the relatively poorer Lower East Side, because they wanted to make sure that their kids knew what it was like for the common folk. They wanted their kids to be fluent in music, but not necessarily pursue it as a career. Yeah, how'd that work out? When George was 15, his mother came to terms with 2 things. 1, that her son was never going to become an accountant, and 2, that he was not even going to finish high school. He dropped out in order to work in America's upstart music industry, colloquially known as Tin Pan Alley, although there was never a real physical Tin Pan Alley, just a collection of music publishers based on a couple of New York streets. His employment by the firm of Jerome H. Remick and Company, the primary purveyor of ragtime to the American public, was not as a songwriter, but as a song plugger. He was paid to go to music stores and play the latest hits, to schmooze with performing artists, or being sent off to Atlantic City, New Jersey to advertise in a lucrative resort town. This job required proficiency in sight reading and transposition. Difficult things, but Gershwin was good at both. Song plugging was an entry-level position in Tin Pan Alley, but it got him $15 a week, which is $384 a week in today's money. And here I thought my church gig was lucrative. Shout out to Doug, by the way, sometimes he watches these things. He stuck with it long enough to get his own works published. His first published piece was 1917's Rialto Ripples, co-composed with Will Donaldson, which got him $11.75 in today's money. But Gershwin leveraged his positions to work his way up through the industry, eventually getting a job cutting player piano rolls. No one knows quite how many rolls he contributed because he did so often under pseudonyms, and a lot before he was 18. He made twice his weekly salary cutting these rolls, which is a tedious job, I'll grant you, but for that kind of cash, I'd floss a giraffe. His large hands and facility at the keyboard without using a lot of pedal made him an ideal performer not just of these pieces but of popular music in general. His hard work in composition led to his first full-length musical, La La Lucille, which premiered in May 1919. Around the same time, singer Al Jolson, widely regarded as America's preeminent entertainer, heard Gershwin's song Swanee and liked it so much that he sang it himself.
I've been away from you a long time. I never thought I'd miss you so. Somehow I feel your love is real. Near you I want to be.
Swanee was a loving parody of / tribute to Stephen Foster's parlor song Old Folks at Home, and its success helped Gershwin on his journey to Broadway, where his debut was disastrous. He was hired as a pianist and then lost his place in the very first show. But he persisted, working as a rehearsal pianist for the Ziegfeld Follies, before being hired as a staff composer for Max Dreyfus, head of T.B. Harms. Exactly when Gershwin quit Remix Company is disputed, but it happened at some point in 1917. Dreyfuss was a politically calculating figure who sought to monopolize Broadway with the songs he published, and hiring Gershwin was maybe the best move he ever made. Dreyfuss raked in a whopping $165 million in today's money when he sold his music publishing firm to Warner Brothers in 1929. Along the line, Gershwin collaborated with characters like William Merrigan Daly, described in the papers as an eccentric musical play doctor who quit formal music training at 13 and bounced around between magazine editorships and assistant conductor gigs before somehow landing on Broadway. Daly threaded the needle between the classical and popular worlds, which were already beginning to culturally grow apart, and would be a lifelong mentor to Gershwin. Chief among the many enduring misconceptions about Gershwin is that he didn't know much in matters of orchestration, although this is a complete falsehood, and we're going to get to why in a few minutes. It was folks like Daly who were given the credit for being orchestration mentors to Gershwin, although Daly, by his own admission, had an orchestration course which consisted of going to the opera and just listening to what was going on. But we digress. From thence on, Gershwin was pretty regularly employed as a composer of show tunes, which was a demanding job which required a high turnaround rate. Gershwin collaborated with Buddy DeSilva on a series of reviews, but it was with 1924's Lady Be Good, written with his brother Ira, that George achieved the biggest Broadway success. From then on, the brothers were an inseparable creative duo, and again, more on them in a few minutes as well. Also, if you're interested in the nitty-gritty details of each and every one of the many musicals on which Gershwin worked, I cannot recommend this book highly enough. It was a primary source for this video. It's a non-chronological biography, which I find a little bit annoying, but it's a fantastic reference book because most of this is just thorough chronology of who he worked with and when, especially when it came to all the musicals, which constitute a large percentage of his output. In the 20s, Gershwin wanted to study with someone he felt to be a real bona fide composer. And so he studied with Reuben Goldmark, not his first choice, and more known today as a teacher of other composers, but a fine person with whom to study. He was a founding member of the Juilliard faculty, and Aaron Copland ranked among his students. We don't know how many lessons Gershwin got from Goldmark, but when you look at the timeline, it's clear that Gershwin was already having quite a bit of success, and yet still always wanted to study with someone who felt had been in the business longer, who just had more experience, perhaps which stemmed from more education. Gershwin often told his friends that he wanted to retire from popular music, go someplace less hectic, and devote himself entirely to serious music. This tells us not just a lot about Gershwin and his aspirations, but the culture as well. A culture that at that point firmly believed that there was no way for someone to be both a success in classical and popular music. Writing show tunes was more than a full-time job, but he continually sought out lessons with well-respected and well-regarded composers, which indicates such a freakish level of energy that it's frankly kind of hard to fathom. Meanwhile, in the concert halls of New York City, bandleader and musical jack-of-all-trades Paul Whiteman was putting jazz on the concert stage and experimenting in pieces that fuse the sounds and improvisations of jazz with the refined techniques of the classical realm. Whiteman and Gershwin had originally collaborated on a review in 1922, and the always planning Whiteman asked Gershwin if he'd write a concerto-like piece for his ensemble. He asked in November 1923, and the concert was already slated for February 12th, 1924. Gershwin said no, because I just don't think I have the time to do that. I mean, it's a quick turnaround. And, well, Whiteman said that was okay, and Gershwin thought that was that. But there was a bit of a mix-up, because just by sheer happenstance, according to legend, Ira read in the newspaper, not long after the new year, that his brother was working on a jazz concerto for the Whiteman band. So George called Whiteman up, and apparently it was just a mix-up, but George was still left holding the pot. He had to write a concerto in about a month. He produced Rhapsody in Blue, the definitive classical jazz fusion composition. He plotted the piece out on a train ride to Boston, putting together pieces that he'd already had and assembling them in a way that made coherent sense to him. And he credited the train ride itself for giving him inspiration. He said that he often heard music in the heart of noise. While pages of the short score were still being written, Gershwin sent them off to Whiteman's orchestrator, Fer de Grosfer, who orchestrated them for the particular ensemble that was Whiteman's band. This was a jazz ensemble which had a lot of unique doublings in it, and it was being augmented by a string section. The decision to do this may have been in part because Gershwin was a bit hesitant about his still mostly untested orchestration skills, but mostly it was because he had a month to write a concerto, and writing it was hard enough. And besides, he didn't want to invest the time necessary to learn all the ins and outs and unique doublings of Whiteman's ensemble. The piece was, and I don't have to tell you this, a complete smash hit, despite the fact that it was near the end of a marathon air-conditionless concert on a Tuesday evening. It was so popular that Whiteman's band adopted it as their signature tune. All jazz bands had to have their signature tune, and having your tune be their signature tune was a real honor. While Gershwin did not use the exact 12-bar blues as a part of his Rhapsody in Blue, he did pull a lot from ragtime and the blues as source material. He used syncopations, chromaticism, calls and responses, pedal tones, etc. It owes a significant debt to Scott Joplin's handling of rhythm, as Joplin preferred to craft syncopations without using dotted rhythms. And there aren't a lot of dotted rhythms in the Rhapsody in Blue as notated, although Gershwin did record a few cut-down versions of the Rhapsody in Blue later on, and occasionally we can hear him swing some straight eighths, but this seems to be more of a preference thing than what he intended the piece to be played as. Otherwise he would have probably notated it. The conductor Walter Damrosch was at the premiere of the Rhapsody in Blue, and was so smitten by the piece that he commissioned a more classical concerto in F. The concerto, according to legend, was composed after Gershwin devoured the available orchestration literature in order to teach himself orchestration. Although this is a mischaracterization. We're going to get to that in just a second. The truth in that story is that it was, at that point, the most genuinely Gershwin piece yet written. It was composed and orchestrated by the man himself, and it featured his prodigious pianistic talents at the premiere in December 1925. The concerto ended up being better received in Europe than the United States, and it still, compared to the pedigree of its composer, rarely performed when compared to the real workhorses of the concerto genre. My theory is that the Rhapsody in Blue is so famous that it overshadows a concerto by the same composer, and its form is a little funkier. It's basically 32-bar sections, which are linked together by pianistic fireworks. Or so it sounds on first listen. This is why Prokofiev didn't like it. He called it drunken and inept. But no two theorists that I've read seem to agree on what the form actually is. The more you look at the form of the concerto, the more complicated it is. The difficulty in categorizing Gershwin's works in existing genres led to a new label, that of symphonic jazz. The commonly perceived order of events was that Gershwin knew little to nothing of orchestration before writing his concerto, but nothing could be further from the truth. There's evidence of him taking orchestration lessons in classes at Columbia University in the early 1920s. And really, the myth comes from a couple of different sources, all of which are easily debunked. The first is the aforementioned story about Grofé orchestrating the Rhapsody in Blue, but that has to do with, well, there was just a time crunch, and Grofé knew that ensemble in a way that no other person could because he'd been orchestrating for it for so long. The second is that he didn't orchestrate his own Broadway musicals, which is pretty much standard practice. Again, we're talking about an industry which has such high turnaround rates that as soon as you write a piece of music, as soon as you're done with a song, it's got to go to the orchestrator like yesterday. The same is true for Hollywood. John Williams doesn't orchestrate his own scores. He writes in a short score and he gives it to an orchestrator because you just have to turn these pieces around really, really quickly. The perception of him being a bad orchestrator tells us a lot about how he presented himself to the public. And there are a couple of interesting theories that one can surmise from this. The first is that because he downplayed the level of his education, he was just humble and he was a little bit self-conscious about how little he knew compared to those who'd gone through a conservatory training. Or maybe because he had studied voraciously on his own and he had taken all these lessons, perhaps he was going for a public persona as a kind of savant. If the latter were his goal, he could present himself to the public as a genius in the most humble possible fashion. And if that's true, he probably got the idea from ragtime artists, who often presented themselves to the public as not knowing anything about reading sheet music, even though they could, as a way to present themselves as being something fresh and new and outside the classical tradition. True to form, he said in a 1928 interview that he knew little to nothing about form. although the record of his large-scale works begs to differ. Regardless of his actual skills in orchestration and form, Gershwin believed that he had further to go. The trouble was that most composers he met declined to give him lessons. Maurice Ravel was one of the first, but in Ravel's defense, he was always pretty reticent to take on new students. Among them, he said that only Vaughan Williams wrote music that wasn't Ravel-light. And he told Gershwin, famously, that lessons would turn him from a first-rate Gershwin to a second-rate Ravel. But Ravel had a lot of fondness for Gershwin's music, and the two would be good acquaintances, if not friends. Ravel, in recommending Gershwin to Nadia Boulanger, wrote glowingly of his talent, saying that worldwide success no longer satisfies him. Boulanger was a fan of Gershwin's works, but she said that she had nothing to teach him, and Gershwin would later brag about this. While in Paris, he also met Jacques Ibert, who was flustered at the idea that this American would seek to study orchestration with him. He was maybe the only post-World War I American expatriate in Paris that couldn't get a freaking composition lesson from anybody. He was the only person who doubted his own inherent skill. Edgar Varese turned him down, saying that they were going in different musical directions. And on a surface aesthetic level, that's true. After all, nothing could be further from the atonal sound masses and exotic percussion of Varese than the sweet, jazzy melodies and general accessibility of Gershwin. Right? Except Varese was fond of using sirens in his work to imitate the hustle and bustle of cities, which he was fascinated by, and Gershwin used car horns in his An American in Paris, the tone poem that was the most significant work to come out of his time in the French capital. In their imitations of the hustle and bustle of city life and the urban experience, they really weren't that far apart. Successful study only came under American composers, who perhaps more intuitively understood the sound world from which Gershwin was coming. Most notably, his teachers in America included Henry Cowell, one of my grand teachers, which makes Gershwin like a cousin on one of those who taught who teaching trees that musicians like so much. So, okay, what was all this study really about? Well, in Ravel's words, Gershwin was searching for something greater. But in Gershwin's words, he didn't really know what that something greater was. For Gershwin, serious music was almost stereotypical, rigorous fugues or really good string quartets. And he mentioned on many occasions his desire to write a really good string quartet. He was a voracious consumer of knowledge. In musical terms, this meant that he knew everything from the music of Bach to the music of Polynesia, all in a hectic self-imposed course of study which lasted throughout his entire life. How the idea that he was inept even began is beyond me. For Gershwin, the best music lay at the confluence of the heart and the brain. Those are the two aspects of it, and you can have good music on either end. Tchaikovsky was all heart, Ravel was all brain. Gershwin wanted an equal mixture of both. He was a perfectionist such that, had he ever written that really good string quartet he wanted, he likely wouldn't have given himself the pleasure of appreciating that accomplishment. If he'd ever written that, he'd have just wanted to write the next big thing. He was always pressing to do something big and new. Hungarian-born composer-violinist Edward Kalinyi, Gershwin's second major teacher, saw the driving harmonic force behind Gershwin's music as that of propinquity. This was his translation of the German term Stufenreichtum, which came from Arnold Schoenberg's treatise Harmonielehre. The idea behind this, and this is a simplification, is that you can have smooth, mostly chromatic lines in the soprano, alto, tenor, and bass lines, and you could generate funky passing chords, which would all work chromatically speaking, because you'd be going from one harmony to another, but if you analyze them vertically, they wouldn't necessarily turn out to be a functional chord. They'd just be a passing chord which would arise from the passing motion in all these different voices. And there's obviously a lot more to it than that, but the basic gist is that it's going to generate a lot of chords which don't have a clear and obvious function in tonal music. Check out this excerpt from Rhapsody in Blue for a visual example of this technique and action. Propinquity isn't a rigorous compositional technique as such, so Gershwin's use of it was as personal as, like, my use of it. Gershwin was known for being a particularly harmonically complex composer, not just because he was using this technique of propinquity, but also because he used so-called consonant 7th, 9th, and 11th chords, extended harmonies up in thirds, instead of just triads. I say consonant because they didn't need to resolve. They were treated as though they were consonant chords. In his concert music, he largely stays away from 2, 4, 8, 16, and 32 bar sections. In his Rhapsody in Blue, the whole opening section is 5 and 7 bar phrases, things that are just a little bit off. In the AABA form, which characterizes a lot of his piano music, the B section tends to be a lot shorter than the A section. It's more of a reprieve from the A section than a whole section in its entirety. The Gershwin finale is usually a slow statement of the main theme followed by a grand flourish to the very end, borrowed from Broadway and Hollywood. Speaking of Broadway, we have to keep in mind that throughout the entirety of his career, Gershwin was working on several Broadway musicals per year. He was really putting the music in musicals. Some were hits, some were flops. Few are known today in their original forms. Why? Take one of the hits, 1930's Girl Crazy, far outshone by I Got Rhythm, one of its selections. It's so popular that the rhythm changes is a jazz term used to describe the chord progression from that song, which has since been lifted for other pieces. He was able to write all these beloved American show tunes because he was able to collaborate with Ira on the songs, and they had such a close and special working relationship that they were essentially two sides of the same coin. Even though Gershwin's musical ideas would take slight precedence over Ira's lyrical ideas, they both had a knack for snappy and memorable turns of musical and linguistic phrase. If Ira had an idea for a melody, he would suggest it to George, and if George had an idea for a rhyme that might fit a little snippet of melody he had, he would suggest it to Ira. They were truly co-composed as songs. George's hectic schedule meant that many a piece went scrapped or incomplete. Take his 3 preludes for piano, originally slated to be a set of 24 in the vein of Bach or Scriabin or Chopin. One of my personal favorites is the Impromptu in 2 keys, which is a little ditty composed in the 1920s, reworked into a piano piece, and then stuffed in a closet for about 50 years until it was rediscovered in 2 versions, or 4 keys. The Broadway experience was good money and it was consistent throughout the Depression, but Gershwin wanted more. Musicals were just the American version of opera, opera's kid brother, and Gershwin wanted to write an opera. His first attempt, 1922's Blue Monday, had flopped miserably, but he learned more since then, and he wanted to adapt a particular story. In 1926, he had read DuBose Hayward's novel Porgy, and he wanted to bring this to the operatic stage. This came to fruition when the Gershwins and Hayward signed a contract in 1933 that would officially bring that story to life. To prepare, Gershwin went to South Carolina and immersed himself in the music of Black life through the middle of 1934. The premiere of Porgy and Bess the following year wasn't a failure, but it wasn't an outright success either. It walked the line between opera and musical, especially as the original version lacked recitative. Porgy and Bess is rightfully hailed as a landmark opera in many respects, especially in its clever inclusion of complex compositional techniques. But it has earned itself some controversy in a few respects. When compared to, say, Scott Joplin's opera Treemonisha, or Duke Ellington's ill-fated revue Jump for Joy, which were both by black artists, featured black casts, and, importantly, cut against the prevailing stereotypes of black life, Porgy and Bess only has one of those things in common, and that's the color of the cast. The prevailing stereotypes are just accepted. They're used as a backdrop for the story, and they're not really challenged in any significant way. In Porgy's case, if they were challenged, then the opera as we know it would have to have a different plot. Some casts have found it distasteful that this opera portrays black life as nothing but drugs, gambling, and fisticuffs. It's not an overtly racist opera because these are human characters. They're treated as good people and bad people and everything in between. It's not a matter of white supremacy, it's a matter of just telling a story and what happens to be a very stereotyped environment. George and Ira put their feet down firmly against the inclusion of white casts in the opera, which was a bold move for the time and helped launch the careers of several prominent black singers who otherwise had no major roles in the operatic repertoire. It is literally a contractual obligation for opera companies to produce the opera in accordance with the Gershwin's estate's wishes. But that hasn't meant smooth sailing, especially when it comes to the Hungarian state opera. There was a run in the mid-1970s that they did in blackface, which, in the 1920s it was a bad move, but in the 1970s, man, come on. As recently as 2018, there was an all-white cast, and this was arguably done as a political move to galvanize the right wing in advance of the eventual re-election of longtime Prime Minister Viktor Orban. The 2018 production reframed the opera as a story about refugees during the ongoing migrant crisis being stuck at an airport, but because it was done with an all-white cast, they actually had to put in the fine print that it was done contrary to the wishes of the executors of the Gershwin estate. I believe the full quote is contrary to the requirements for the presentation of the work, because they couldn't legally stop a staging. Porgy was not the commercial success that Gershwin had hoped for, and disenchanted with New York, he moved to Los Angeles to start writing more film musicals. While in Los Angeles, Gershwin often played tennis against Arnold Schoenberg, which led to some entertaining photographs. At one point he'd asked Schoenberg for composition lessons as well, only for the Austrian to tell him basically the same thing that Ravel and Boulanger had. His musical gift was augmented by his abilities in the visual arts, and he worked up to be something of a talented amateur painter, not unlike his tennis buddy. Their mutual friend, however, the pianist and general entertainer Oscar Levant, was banned from the tennis court because he insisted on wearing a suit out there. In late 1936 and early 1937, Gershwin began complaining about headaches and the smell of burnt rubber. By February of 1937, these had metastasized into blackouts, lack of coordination, and memory issues, which led to a disastrous performance of his concerto. His family was concerned for his mental health. He'd had 2 seizures in June, which led to him, in the first instance, trying to push his valet out of a moving car, and second, smearing chocolate on Ira's wife. Despite all the mounting evidence, doctors said that they couldn't find a physical cause. They attributed it to stress and sent Gershwin on his way. On July 9th, he collapsed. This led to a frantic cross-country game of telephone, as neurosurgeons in Los Angeles wanted to get the best neurosurgeon in the country, who was Dr. Walter Dandy, who at that point was out fishing on the Chesapeake Bay with Maryland Governor Harry Nice. The White House was contacted, and they sent the Coast Guard out to get him, but Dandy could never get to Los Angeles. The situation turned critical, and doctors there had to operate. They removed an enormous brain tumor, but it wasn't enough. George Gershwin died on July 11th, 1937, at the age of 38. There are many theories as to why he got this brain tumor. One was that he used a lot of exotic creams and products in his hair to cure his baldness, and that might have been carcinogenic and got into his scalp and caused it that way. But it seems to me that in equal likelihood, it could have been his many brain injuries that he got as a kid. He got chased around and beaten up by a Irish street gang, and at one point got kicked in the nose by a horse. I mean, psychologically, I understand. We like to know the reason that things happen to people. We like to have a one-to-one correlation, like, this happened because of that, but sometimes it's just bad luck. We do know that he was a fan of anti-balding remedies, though. He was rather self-conscious about it, let's say. One of these remedies included a metal suction cup that be attached to his head, and we do know that that gave him headaches, even if it wasn't responsible for the tumor. After his brother's death, Ira would go on to collaborate with some of the biggest names in American music, Aaron Copland and Kurt Weill among them, but eventually retired because he had to dedicate his life to promoting his brother's estate. The post-mortem reception of Gershwin's works to me has been odd and largely imbalanced. After his death was when the rumors of his inability to orchestrate, or his inability to truly include jazz, began to spread. One is, as we just did earlier, debunked, and the other is just an opinion. And while pieces like the Rhapsody in Blue have remained a cornerstone, a real bedrock of American music, the other pieces that he wrote have seemed to fall by the wayside. Not just the Concerto in F, but also the third major piano and large ensemble piece that he wrote, which was the second Rhapsody, occasionally known as the Rhapsody in Rivets, which was adapted from some film music. And these are all 3 fantastic pieces. They're somewhat similar to one another in that it's the Gershwin style. It's piano and orchestra, or piano and ensemble in the case of Rhapsody in Blue, which exists in a couple of different versions. Overall, I just think that these other 2 pieces get the short shrift because they're not the Rhapsody in Blue. The Rhapsody in Blue happened to come first, and he tried to recapture some of that magic, but that didn't really happen. His impact on his contemporaries was enormous. Ravel's G major piano concerto, the 2-handed one, was heavily indebted to the Gershwin pieces he so admired. Bela Bartok as well would come to write a Gershwin-esque piece in the form of the 4th of his 6 dances in Bulgarian rhythm, published in 1940. Pretty consistently, when non-American composers were asked of their favorite American composer, the name of George Gershwin would be at the top of their lists. Gershwin's jazz links inspired many in that world as well. Gershwin's long-form pieces are what inspired Duke Ellington to go beyond simply the 3-minute pieces that would go on one side of a record, and truly expand to something approximating the symphonic jazz of Gershwin. Ira said that his brother never allowed himself the time to relax, because his music was more the result of hard work than inspiration. And Gershwin himself said that if he just relied on inspiration, he'd write like 3 songs a year. Aside from a few rarities, Gershwin's works would go up to 12 revisions before they were ready to be published. He kept a small book with him at all times, ready to jot down any melody that might occur to him, sometimes up to 100 per day. The melodies would naturally occur to him, but he really had to work to incorporate them and refine them in ways that he liked. Leonard Bernstein ranked him alongside Tchaikovsky as composers who had this knack for consistently producing a nice tune, but made sure to make a distinction between what made a good melodist and what made a good composer. Speaking of the Rhapsody in Blue specifically, he said that you could endlessly recut and reorganize the piece, and it would still essentially be the same piece, whereas you couldn't do the same thing with, say, a Beethoven symphony. But what makes Beethoven great and what makes Gershwin great are two different things. In Beethoven, he wasn't really known for being a great melodist. I mean, he's better than people give him credit for, but he wasn't like Gershwin level or Tchaikovsky level. What makes Beethoven so great is what he does with the material he creates. Whereas in Gershwin, the brilliance is in the material itself, aside from Porgy and Bess, where he really develops it in complex ways. It's mostly just about a nice tune. For all his accessibility, Gershwin actively embraced the avant-garde. Even if he didn't write avant-garde music, he certainly appreciated it. He attempted to get in touch with, and failed to get in touch with, Charles Ives, who was increasingly frail and reticent in his later years, as well as Hans Barth, an early quarter-tone enthusiast and innovator. Gershwin and Barth apparently collaborated on a quarter-tone rendition of the second of Gershwin's 3 preludes for piano for a concert in December 1930. I wanted to get my hands on a recording of this or a score, but I can't seem to find it anywhere, so if you have any leads, my email's in the description. I'm gonna bet because that prelude is based on the blues, the quarter tones are used as passing tones or as blue notes to color what Gershwin wrote. Gershwin loved dancing and all forms of sport and physical activities, comparing composition to the mental rigor of, like, running around outside. He was very physically active because he felt like his body should keep up with the work his brain was doing when he was composing. Before we go, I think I have to make mention of Gershwin's flirtatiousness and promiscuity with women, which I only mentioned to dispel another long-standing myth, which was that he was gay. I mean, there have been plenty of gay composers, he just wasn't one of them. The era wasn't great on, like, consent and women's rights issues, but even then his friends thought he could be a little handsy, especially when his mind started to deteriorate at the end. At one point he groped actress June Gale, who was then the girlfriend and later the wife of Oscar Levant. Despite his physicalness, most people described him as emotionally distant. He never married, but his longest-term relationship was with composer Kay Swift, who, unlike Gershwin, was married. To Gershwin, American music meant something very specific, that it must express the hectic pace of American life, to immortalize the strivings of the masses, to encapsulate the burst of energy and noise that ran in the streets between the skyscrapers. He saw jazz as representative of a noisy boisterousness that, while crude at times and rough around the edges, expressed America in a way that nothing else could. For Gershwin, jazz wasn't associated with a given skin color, although it had its roots in spirituals and the blues. He saw it as a conglomeration of many things, impossible to nail down as exactly one thing. He saw himself very much as a product of his time, and he wanted his music to express the American experience. I'd like my compositions to be so vital that I'd be required by law to dispense sedatives with each score sold, Gershwin once said. His sadly shortened life did not diminish the quality of his work. In Bernstein's words, he was one of the greatest voices that ever rang out in the history of American urban culture.